Save. Share screen. Make sure I do English. And play. Alrighty, so second book of the Bible here, Exodus. And then just a reminder of, and if you have any questions also, just put them in the chat, reminder. And if you have any questions, you can type them up over there on the Facebook. And I've got that, I'm watching that over there. I can check the YouTube later. I can only have so many screens open at once. So today we're talking about Exodus. Reminder, this is the plan for the upcoming. I made one adjustment. I moved wisdom back a week because I think we're going to have a retreat in Spanish for our various ministers. So basically we'll be going every other week during Lent. And that gives you more time to read the book. Job, Ecclesiastes, and Wisdom for our Lenten Bible study. Those seem like appropriate Lenten books, especially Job. All right. So talking about Exodus. First of all, I just want to remind folks that there is this podcast. Just a reminder, I remind people last week, but Father Mike Schmitz does a great job guiding us through the Bible, reading the Bible and giving a commentary. And then if you have one book on an Old Testament commentary, this is just fantastic. I'm really glad that I discovered this book. It's the best commentary that I have discovered on the Old Testament. It talks about the historical method, but doesn't get stuck there, and talks about a lot of the spiritual aspects, and especially how it connects to our Catholic faith. If you want something not as intense, I also recommend this Peter Kreeft, You Can Understand the Bible, which takes briefly through each of the books of the Bible. It's also very good. And so those two are good references. And I've used especially quite a bit of this one as I've been revisiting Exodus. And then as another reference, which Father Mike Schmitz uses, this is the Bible Timeline Bible. There's a course called the Bible Timeline. This is a beautiful Bible. I just ordered the Spanish one actually last night. So I'll have that to go through as well, because it would have been really nice to have this chart in my Spanish class as well, but hopefully I'll have it by next week or the week after. But I didn't talk so much about the covenants, and I should have probably. It's a great way that the Bible Timeline and Jeff Cavins goes through that, and he talks about the covenants that are made. I like this idea of the one holy couple, one holy family, one holy tribe, one holy nation, one holy kingdom, and one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So we then are going to be here. We've gone through the first three covenants that God has made with Adam, with Noah, and with Abraham. And now he's making a covenant today as we read in Exodus to be the one holy nation. And then there have been, of course, some movie adaptations of this. Exodus is probably one of the most famous stories of the entire Bible. And probably most people remember the Ten Commandments, which I think shows at Easter time every year, if I recall, on some station. And I am not sure if I've actually ever seen the entire 10 Commandments. I've seen bits and pieces, but I'm not sure if I've ever sat down and watched the whole thing. Maybe I should. I'm more familiar with a more recent adaptation, The Prince of Egypt, the cartoon version, which is also quite lovely. So those are two very good versions. So those are two good adaptations of the Exodus story. So you might be familiar with those. But are you familiar with the War for the Planet of the Apes? Which is, I recently rewatched this. I think Father Nashmore and I sat down and watched it several months ago, and I was like, "Wow, that is the Moses story." And I hadn't really realized that on the first watching, or I'd forgotten that. So I like the Planet of the Apes. There's the old ones, of course, that came out in the 1960s, the 5 first movies, and they rebooted. Ignore that one that came out in 2001. It's terrible, terrible. But there was a reboot then that came out, I think 2011 and 14 and 16 or 17 or something. But there's a lot of connections with the Exodus story. So if you watch that and kind of think of it as kind of a Bible story, it's pretty good. Of course, it involves apes, but it's also very good. So for your further Exodus reflection, if you'd like to continue to watch or reflect in a cinematic way, those are 3 recommendations that I would make for you. Okay, so jumping into Exodus, the book itself. It sounds itself like a sequel. Well, it is. It's the second book, but I like the way very much that it begins, where it says, talking about the number of people, and then chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "Now Joseph and all of his brothers and that whole generation died." It really sounds like, okay, you've heard this story, and now we're moving into a new era, a new story. So it does very much sound like a sequel. We have none of the same characters that we had in the first book. We have a totally new generation. The scope is the early and the midlife of Moses, so around 1250 BC. It's the second book of the Pentateuch. And unlike Genesis, it is not character driven. So what I tried to do last week talking about Genesis is really focusing in that we have characters and a whole bunch of them. And it really sets the tone. We move from one to another, moving through generations, hundreds of years between them sometimes as we hear what is happening. This is a very different book. It does have some connection with the Joseph story in that it's much more plot driven, and it's a story driven book, much more than Genesis, which is like, here's this character and here's this character and here's this character. Exodus, we have really very few characters, and it's more of a plot following our protagonist, Moses. So similar to Joseph, which we follow the protagonist of Joseph. And then I try to keep things, simple. What's the kind of basic organization of the book? There are 2 major sections in Exodus. Chapters 1 through 20, the exciting part. Chapters 21 through 40, the boring part. Because there is a major shift that happens. The book really comes to a screeching halt there at chapter 21. It's really exciting. There's plagues and there's crossing the Red Sea, and it's all very exciting. And then we stop. As the Petrie says in this book, he says, when people start to read the Bible, when they make this pledge, I'm going to read the Bible cover to cover, this is where generally people stop. It's like, what just happened? We just fell off a cliff here. So chapters 1 through 20, very exciting. Lots of plot. Chapters 21 through 40, not so much. To break that down a little bit, I'm going to focus much more on the first 20 chapters because there's a lot there. But chapters 25 through 30 are the plans for the ark in very clear, possibly excruciating details, talking about measurements of cubits and this and that. So we got the plans. It's kind of like It's kind of like reading blueprints, ancient blueprints for how things are going to be constructed. Then chapter 35 is like a capital campaign, which is always very exciting. They take up a collection, okay, great, to build the stuff, and then they have the execution of the plans. So you have, here's what it's going to be, now let's take up money to make it happen, and collection of the various other things, the materials and everything, time, talent, and treasure, right? And then let's tell you exactly that this was exactly done the way that was planned. So I'm being a little bit silly or snide or whatever, but we do actually appreciate those things when we do these things in real life. Like when we built Good Shepherd, I mean, it's before my time, obviously, but I believe that there was a plan. This is what we are going to do. Then we're going to take up a collection, take up the time, talent, and treasure so we can make this happen. And then we will report back to people that we actually did what we said we were going to do. And so that reads very similarly. Again, it's not the most exciting reading, but it is also, it's very comforting, I think, when we see that the plans actually happen as we said we were going to do them, and here they are. It's a very important piece to a capital campaign, especially if you've given money or you've given time, talent, and treasure. Did they actually use the money the way they said they were going to do it? Yes, they did. So that's kind of how the last piece of Exodus reads, is here's what's going to happen with the ark, and we did it. So what kind of style are we talking about here? Oh, wait. What I missed? I'm missing a slide. Hold on a second. I thought I'm missing a slide. Well, no, I'm not. Okay, it's coming. I got ahead of myself. So who are the characters then that we see in Exodus? On a side note also, so we have the exciting part for the first 20 chapters, all these characters. We have the boring part, the next 20 chapters. And just to give a sneak peek for next week, we pick up right where we left off in Leviticus with lots more boring parts. But I think there's excitement too to them, but it's not plot driven. We dropped the plot for a few books until I think the second half of Numbers. So, but hang in there. But there is some great stuff to be found yet, even so, in Leviticus and in Numbers. But those are different books, and we'll get to those. So we have our main protagonist. The central figure is Moses. And so we're probably all remember his early life and how he was put in the basket, which, interestingly enough, the word that's used for that basket is the same word that they use for the Ark of Noah. So the idea of Moses traveling along the waters is the same image. It's meant to capture that same image of Noah traveling across the waters, because it is the same word. So when he's put into that basket, the same word is used in Hebrew for the ark. So Moses, he's put in that water and he's saved and he's brought up as an Egyptian, and then he finds the fight going on between the Egyptian and the Hebrew, and he kills the Egyptian, and that sends him on this really whole journey. They find that he's afraid that someone's going to find out about him, and then he encounters more of the Hebrew people. That's when he meets, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you all remember that way that story goes. He is saved by that basket. It is presumed that Moses grew up in Pharaoh's court, but we don't really get that exactly in the scripture, other than Pharaoh's daughter adopted him as his son. We don't know how many daughters Pharaoh had, but there's never really any sense that Moses knew the Pharaoh personally. Now, again, I don't remember exactly how it goes down in 10 Commandments, but in the Prince of Egypt, there's, they're played as kind of being brothers and part of the same thing there, but we don't really have that account in Exodus. It seems like there is not really, the two really don't even know each other. That's how the scripture more reads. And then Moses had some sort of speech impediment. It's not clear, but it does say in chapter 4:10, it says, if you please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor recently, nor now that you have spoken to your own servant, for I am slow of speech and tongue. He does not want to be the speaker on behalf of God because he does not have an eloquent voice. Of course, this gets lost in the Charlton Heston version, of course, because Charlton Heston has a great voice, right? And so he's not at all a bad speaker. But mostly who we actually hear about is Aaron, who does most of the speaking. And Aaron is like a prophet, if you will, to Moses, who says he will be the mouthpiece or the spokesman for Moses. So Aaron really gets most of the lines and does most of the speaking because either Moses had a stutter or something going on that he was not a very good speaker. And Aaron is the one who does most of the talking through Exodus. So Aaron is Moses' brother. We're not entirely sure if it's like a literal brother or some sort of, hey, you're my brother. Hey, bro. But we don't know exactly what's going on. So over and over again, we hear God speaking to Moses saying, tell Aaron to do this and this and this. Tell Aaron to say this and this and this. Okay. So those are two of our main characters. We often forget about Aaron, but he does a lot of speaking. And then, of course, we have the Pharaoh, who's kind of the enemy. He's what stands in their way to freedom. He doesn't have a name. He's just Pharaoh. Many people call him that he is Ramses II, but the Exodus never actually gives him a name. So when we read it spiritually, and that's an important piece for us to read, Pharaoh was seen as a god in the Egyptian world. We have all these burials and everything, and he was seen as being like a god. And that's why these pyramids and all these statues and temples to the Pharaoh. And so Exodus, if you will, it's a war of the gods. It's the true God versus the Egyptian god versus Pharaoh, and who is going to win. That's the drama that is set up with Exodus. And of course, what is revealed through this book is that God has all the power. So as far as characters in the book of Exodus, that's pretty much it, with a few extras. So the majority of the book is about the conflict. I guess God would be a character as well. So God, I probably should have put a picture of God too, because it's God versus Pharaoh, with Moses speaking or presenting on behalf of God and Aaron speaking on behalf of Moses. That's the main thing that's going on. Now, there are a few other characters. We have Miriam, who is Moses and Aaron's sister, but she does not do much in Exodus. We hear of her, but she's got a much bigger role in the book of Numbers. So stay tuned. We are introduced to this character, but we'll hear about her more in a later book. And I really like that too, because I like these introductions of characters that we see much later. I like that in like episodic shows, like you plant one thing here in one movie or one book, and you are introduced to that character, but that person doesn't do much until much later. And so I mentioned that like about Star Wars and stuff. I like how you get this character that comes in episode 1 or whatever, and then that person really doesn't have much of a significance until episode 3 or 4 or whatever. So similarly, in this book of Exodus, we get introduced to some characters that don't really play a role yet, but they will. We have Jethro, or Raul, who is Moses' father-in-law to the father of Zipporah, who is Moses' wife. There's really not much of a romance there, although the movies sometimes play that up a little bit, but there's not much, not much there. We hear about that story in chapter 2. He's talking to Jethro, Raul, and he says, Moses agreed to live with him, and the man gave him his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore him a son, whom he named Gershom. There's your romance right there. There's not much to it. But here's the wife. They get married. They have a son. So there's Gershom, which is his son. And then there's an interesting kind of side note, if you will, regarding Gershom, is Moses returns to Egypt, and and God comes to kill Moses in chapter 4, verse 24, which seems awfully odd. Here you go. I've set up my this servant to bring my people out of slavery, and now I'm going to go kill him. Well, what's the deal? On the journey, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord came upon Moses and would have killed him, but Zipporah took a piece of flint and cut off her son's foreskin, and touching his person, she said, "You are the spouse of blood to me." So it's about the circumcision. Remember, we heard about that in Genesis. And so he did not have Gershom circumcised, and it's a reminder of the importance of the covenant. Remember who I am. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but remember who I am. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember the covenant. You are to be a Hebrew, a follower of the covenant. And if we read in Genesis 17:14, remember, backing up to Abraham, if a male is uncircumcised, such a one shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So even Moses, that's an important piece. Even Moses is subject to the law. It's a great reflection for us, because nobody is above the law, right? We have had problems with that in the past, right? Of people thinking I am above the law doesn't apply to me. We had that whole thing with the abuse crisis, and continue to have some struggles with that. Well, I'm above the law, I don't need to follow this or that. Even Moses is not above the law. And so he is subject to this covenant there. So it's a great really spiritual lesson that if Moses needs to be obedient to the law, so does everybody, because Moses is the greatest figure, arguably, of the Old Testament. And then there's one kind of other character, and you're gonna be seeing several of these here. Someone had a lot of time on their hand and put together the brick Bible. thebrickbible.com, if you want to go check out that website. It's pretty interesting, pretty humorous, and pretty accurate, really. And someone had a whole lot of time where they did a lot of telling the Bible story according to Legos. So the Israelites form this other character. They're kind of like a Greek chorus, if you will, that they speak as one, they complain as one, they disobey as one, they follow as one. So they are like this one voice. So kind of like a Greek tragedy, or comedy, I guess, for that matter. So thebrickbible.com, that's another reference that you can go check out. It used to be called the Brick Testament, and now it looks like it's all by video, and they don't much if they have these pictures there as much anymore. So it brings us up to the genre. What kind of genre are we talking about here with Exodus? It's, if you will, a stylized history. or an artistic drama. It's not meant to be exact history. That's not the point. Some of the commentaries say that Exodus really arose out of worship and telling the story through worship. So it is a stylized history. And there are artistic liberties that are taken in the telling of the story. It's not meant to be an exact historical account. It's stylized, like most things are stylized. I mean, if we look at the crucifixion, for instance, I mean, how many different takes have we seen with the presentation of the crucifixion? There's all kinds of ways to imagine that, reimagine that. We've got this image, and then we've got this, which is very different. It's very stylized, right? So this is a way to think perhaps of Exodus. It's still telling the story, but in some stylized fashions that might be rather difficult for us to get our brain around. So we don't want to get too wrapped up in the details, but recognize that there are some stylistic things that are going on that we are hundreds of years separated from, and it's hard for us to get into that. Here's another image, of course, of the crucifixion. So very different artistic stylings on that. I was reflecting also, the way that we tell stories has just evolved over the years. And it's very hard to read an ancient story and to take into the account the times. Like, it's interesting, I was thinking about putting up another image of television shows. I was going to put up maybe the image of, remember the 1970s television show, The Incredible Hulk? I used to like watching that as a kid. And there's this new thing that came out on Netflix or something called WandaVision, which is another thing about superheroes or whatever in that same Marvel kind of world. But it's really interesting if you watch the television shows of the 1960s and the 1970s, they tend to be much more independent episodes, and there's much less relying on previous episodes of what has happened before. They're mostly just standalone adventures of the Hulk or of whatever, and very little tying into previous episodes. Nowadays, it's very much the style to have all these things really connected, and you have to really watch episode 1 through 46 to really make sure you understand the story. That's not the way that used to be in the 1960s or 70s. Well, there's a really practical reason for that, of course, is because nowadays you can watch anything whenever you want. Back in the 60s and 70s, if you missed it at Monday at 7 p.m., you missed it, and you are going to be lost. You did not record it on your VCR. You did not stream it. You did not record it to the cloud or whatever. You just missed it. And so you could not tell a story in that way of really connecting this big, long arc of a story. You were just out. And so they were much more about telling an individual separated story, and sometimes kind of repetitive. And sometimes they would even reuse stock footage from episode to episode. Like there was the 1970s Battlestar Galactica. And many times they would use those same shots over and over again for budget reasons or whatever. You can't get away with that today because people will jump on you. It's like, you can't use that shot. You use that in episode 3 at the 5 minute and 16 second. You can't do that again. That's cheating. It's just a different way of telling a story. Similarly, I mentioned this because as we read Exodus, we might hear some repetitiveness. And for us as a reader with a book in front of us, as we can read it and we can go back and reread it, that might say, yeah, we already talked about that. We got that. Well, when you're telling the story orally to a non-literary community, you do have to repeat things. It's a different way of presenting. And so that style has really evolved over time. So if you read the Bible and Exodus or whatever, and it's like, this really sounds strange. Why are we repeating these things? some of that was really practical reasons, and that's the way that you told a story. So keep that in mind as we are hundreds of years separated from, thousands even, from these stories. So what do we have that happens? What are the major events that happen in Exodus? We have major events that happen in Exodus. Big things in this plot. One of those is the burning bush, of course. It'd be hard to rate, what is the most important. Is it the burning bush, or is it another event? But this one's up there. It's a top 5 event of Exodus, that's for sure, and maybe even a top 5 event of the entire Old Testament. But this is where Moses goes to the burning bush. It happens in chapter 3, verse 14, and we get a revelation of who God is, where God says, I am who am. Okay. And if you look at that in the book, remember looking at the footnotes, there's there's a little bit less in this, but there has been a lot of theological ink been spilt on this phrase here. What does this mean? I am who am. Theologically or philosophically, we can talk about God being the foundation of all being. I am the foundation of all the being, and lots of people have talked about it in that way. But there is something about a name. I remember Bishop Barron used to say this, that was kind of a flippant way of responding to Moses. I am who I am. Just get to your work. Don't bother with that. But there's also this idea, which is a fun way of thinking. I am who I am. You are who you are. I have a mission. Let's not get caught up in these kinds of things. But the other thing is the idea in the Jewish sense of, if you have a name, if you have someone's name, you've got kind of an ownership of that person. You know who that person is. But God is fundamentally unknowable in his personhood. He's beyond our understanding. I mean, if we think of our relationship with God, and we think of like our relationship with a pet, like a dog or whatever, how much can a dog or a cat know who we are? They can be in relationship with us, right? That we feed them and that makes them very happy, or they're very happy to see us. But does a dog really know our identity, what's going on in our personhood, in our soul, or whatever? That is way beyond their grasp of understanding. Now, certainly they have capacity for doing several things. They can share in sadness or whatever, but the dog does not know a person in their very identity. Similarly, we are much more so further away from God. We can't know who God is in his self. And there is something with a name, especially for the Jewish people, always means something, right? So when they say, I shall name him this because it means this, we have Isaac, which means laughter, because they laughed with joy that they were going to bear the son. Moses means I have drawn him out of the water or whatever. And so these names mean something. So the meaning of God, you have an understanding of who that person is. And so this phrase, I am who am, says, I am beyond understanding, but I am the God of your fathers. I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So this is the person that I am. We can be in relationship with him, but we can't have ownership of God. I am the God, and there is no other. And the phrase that is used, or the letters that are used, is called the Tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton. I should have put that up in the presentation, but I didn't. And so it's these letters, YHWH, which is the unpronounceable name. It was not to be spoken. Now, this has often been, well, here's the other thing is Hebrew, ancient Hebrew did not have vowels. I can't even imagine that, right? So when you read the ancient Hebrew text, originally there were no vowels. Vowels were added by a series of dots and lines later. But if you read the ancient Hebrew, there are no vowels, which makes sometimes things to be very challenging to read. So what is this word? YHWH. It's meant to be unpronounceable. And a faithful Jewish person would say Adonai or Lord whenever that word came up. They wouldn't even try to pronounce it because that was a grave offense to God. And if this is what it means, I am who am, well, then you are profaning the name of God if you say I am. Wait, no, you are not. So you can't say, who is God? I am. Whoa, blasphemy. So that was one of the reasons you would not say this word, but this is what was kind of attributed to this. But we look at this and we might see the word Yahweh, which again, a Jewish person would never say. And you might remember back in, 2012 or so, Pope Benedict made a decree that we could not use that name anymore in Catholic liturgy. So there were some songs that we used to sing that we do not sing with that name anymore. So Yahweh, I know you are near, right? We changed that to, oh Lord, I know you are near, in respect to our Jewish brothers and sisters. This was a beautiful move by Pope Benedict and very compassionate, very ecumenical, very focused on the interreligious dialogue. Because what would that mean if you brought your Jewish friend to Mass? Oh, come to church with me one day, and then our opening hymn is Yahweh, I know you are near. Like, whoa, blasphemy from the very beginning. So Pope Benedict really mandated that we do not use that word anymore. But again, this is where we have the name Jehovah, or here the Jehovah's Witnesses, because those letters, boy, those are some fun letters if you talk in different languages. Like, what is the Y sound? What is the H sound? What is the W sound? I mean, if you talk to someone who is from India, often they will pronounce, for instance, the W with a V, right? I think we've had some experiences with our Indian brothers and sisters who say welcome. And that's just the way that they will put what we would call a V sound on what we would call a W. And so just a difference there. And then some people, when they pronounce the Y, pronounce it with a J. This is especially evident in some that speak Spanish. Some will say, or like a double L would be the same way, me llama or me llama. What is my name? So there is often that difference of the Y sound and the J sound. And then if you look, so if you move the Y to a J and the W to a V, and you don't have vowels, well, then you can see if you can insert, and I can't poke there, but you can just insert an E between the Y and the H, and you put a O between the H and the W, and you put an A between the W and the H, well, then you've got Jehovah. So there was a mistranslation or a misuse of those letters that go in between there. So that's where those words come from. That's where we get the word Jehovah. It was a application of those letters. Or another way, I guess I could say, too, because it didn't really even exist in the ancient language. Here's more from the Brick Bible. You got the plagues. And there are 10 of them, although some would argue that the 10th plague is kind of like a class of its own. And the footnotes that you find in the New American Bible are actually pretty helpful, I think, on this. So I just turn your attention to that. People would ask, are these natural occurring phenomena or are they miracles? Well, is there a difference? I could say too, because God is the author of natural occurring phenomena. But we do say that these are unique events. And remember, this is stylized history. This is meant to tell us the story in a very dramatic way. And one of the ways perhaps to think of this is as like kind of like a decreation story. He's kind of, God is dismantling these kinds of things. He gets rid of the animals, and he gets rid of the plants, and then he gets rid of light, right? So it's kind of like a backing up of the creation story. And then of course you get to he destroys all of the Adams, the first men of Egypt, the firstborn. So once you have the destruction of the firstborn, then it's the end of the line, and Pharaoh has nothing left. So that's where we have, thus shall you say to the Lord, to the Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn. So the idea of Israel, that character, is the firstborn. God wanted his firstborn, his people, to be set free. Sometimes we also have difficulty with this idea of God. When we read, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, I think we have trouble with that. And what do we make of that? And I think it's similar perhaps to when we think of like Judas. I mean, how much control did God have, and how much did God put that into Judas's heart, and how much did God put that into Pharaoh's heart? Again, I would encourage you to check out the commentary here. I'll just read a little bit here. Is what we hear from Petrie's commentary here. It says, once again, contemporary readers often find troubling the repeated statements, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, seeming to emphasize divine sovereignty to the exclusion of human freedom and rendering the Pharaoh inculpable for his actions. However, in order to understand these statements correctly, equal emphasis must be given to the fact that on several occasions, the text explicitly states that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, or that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. The obvious tension between these phrases is allowed to stand in the final text, emphasizing both the sovereign providence of God and the Pharaoh's willful rejection of God's command. That is both divine providence and human freedom. So it's, again, the stylized way of talking about history. Is God divine? Is God sovereign? Yes. Do we have free will? Yes. How do we hold these things both in balance? Well, we see that played out, if you will, in the Pharaoh's story. And we have this phrase from Job: we accept good things from the Lord, and should we not also accept evil? We'll get into that more when we get into Job. Does evil come from God? Well, how do we process that? Well, we'll get into that, but that's another kind of phrase that's kind of in the background. Also in this Petrie commentary, I really like the way that he talks about the plagues as divine combat. That's a very interesting way to think of that as well. So if you look at the plagues, it's God, the real God, the I am who am, takes down all of the Egyptian gods. The god of the Nile, the fertility god, the beetle god, etc. And then finally, as a last resort, Pharaoh himself. The death of the firstborn. I thought that was a very helpful piece there from Petrie's book. And there it is, that again, we'll cover. And of course, we have the Passover. Boy, this book is chock full of good stuff here. But the blood will mark where you are. Seeing the blood, I will pass over you. So after this plague, then they are to, in this last plague, the killing of the firstborn. This is where they put the blood over the lintels of the houses, and the angel of death will pass over, so the firstborn of the Hebrews are saved. There are a lot of connections to Christ then, of course, in Exodus. It would be hard to overemphasize the importance of Exodus, especially the first part of Exodus, in our history. Jesus is the new Moses because Moses liberates his people from slavery, and Jesus liberates us from this final slavery, this slavery to sin and death. He brings us out. And how are we saved? Of course, it's through his own blood that marks the faithful people. And the New Testament is quite aware of this. And so let me just break this down a little bit about this connection, of course, to the Eucharist and the connection to the Passover. We have the painting over with the blood of the lamb on the lintels, right? So this idea of carrying forth the Passover, you shall keep this Passover until the 14th day. You shall take some of its blood and apply it to the two doorposts. And then in John, we see John the Baptist coming and saying, "Behold the Lamb of God." It is an intentional connection to Exodus. So here is the Lamb that is their salvation. That's what saves them from death. John the Baptist clearly has this in mind when he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Then Moses sprinkles the blood on the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words of his." People sometimes complain that I sprinkle water at Easter, and I'm very thorough with that. Well, at least I'm not sprinkling blood, so just count your blessings, okay? But this idea of sprinkling blood on the people, here is the salvation. This is the new covenant. And so we don't do that by sprinkling, but instead we drink that new covenant. This cup is the covenant in my blood. And so when Jesus initiates the Eucharist, it is a clear connection to Exodus, the blood of the covenant. And the blood will mark the houses where you are. I will pass over you. That's where we just will, and I strike the land of Egypt. And so how were the Egyptians saved? They were saved by the blood of the Lamb. And how are we saved as Christians? There's this clear connection that we are saved by the blood of the Lamb. And this idea, now, of course, when we receive the Eucharist, when we receive either the host or the cup or both, we receive the whole Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity. But there is a clearer sign, and of course, we're not doing this during pandemic time, of people also taking from the cup. But one of the ideas is that there's a very clear symbol that the blood of Jesus is on the lintel of your mouth, if you will. You got blood on your mouth, blood on the entrance into your very being, and that is marked. You are marked in a very literal way and a symbolic way as we take from the chalice. And so there's a beautiful symbol there, which is why I always try to promote that receiving on the cup as well, because although we receive it and we get the whole Jesus in the host, the symbology, the what is happening there is a bit clearer when we also receive from the cup, because there will be a little remnant of precious blood there on your lip, and that's a sign of the covenant. God has entered, and God, the angel of death, will pass by because you are saved. Your lips are marked. And of course, after this moment, Pharaoh finally lets his people go, and they go to the Red Sea. Sometimes people call it the Reed Sea. There is debate on which sea this was that we're talking about. Still, whatever sea it was a miracle. There was this trend back 30, 40 years ago about talking about, well, maybe it was just a natural phenomenon of the waters receding, and that kind of happened each year, that this happened kind of like the tide, and that's the people really took that opportunity to escape, and then the tide came back in, and that's what caused the people to be swallowed. And I really don't care for that kind of reading. It really always, tries to take out all the miracles of God, right? This was a profound experience here. So whether it was the Reed Sea or the Red Sea, sometimes if they talk about the Reed Sea, it's just this little shallow little thing. No, it was some sort of big body of water that clearly the message is the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is their salvation, and brought them out of slavery, symbolized by Egypt, out from the power of another God, or the power of the devil, perhaps, symbolized by Pharaoh, into a new world. And again, there's a great symbology. That's our whole journey. Our whole life is an exodus, right? So we are called from a land of darkness, a land of sin, a land of slavery, into a land of new freedom. So that's that symbolic reading, or that anagogical reading as well, of Exodus. We are taken to a new world. So there's a historical aspect, yes, but there's also a very important theological aspect of what happens in this crossing. If you compare Exodus chapter 16 and John chapter 6, we hear about the bread coming down from heaven. So the people, they're like this one voice, and they are brought out of Egypt. So in this major event, they are saved. They're not in slavery anymore. And then the water comes crashing down. And you would think that the people will be rejoicing. And they do rejoice briefly. But then they are in the desert of sin, which is not actually like literal sin. That's just the name of the desert. So there's not a connection there as far as I know. It says in the chapter 16, here in the desert, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, would that we have died at the Lord's hand at the land of Egypt, as we sat by our flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. But you have led us into this desert to make the whole community die of famine. And so Moses is probably like, I've done these great things. God has done all these great things. And what do? You just complain. It's like some obnoxious children on a trip, right? Are we there yet? I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. Stop. So we get kind of this idea. So we don't even, for that matter, get out of chapter 15, and they're already complaining. So, even a little bit before that, they are already complaining. So it's going to be a long journey, indeed, 40 years of journey. But God responds and gives them manna from heaven, manna in the morning and quail in the evening. So God provides, God feeds them. And Jesus clearly has this in mind when he connects this in John chapter 6, and he's saying, I will give you bread from heaven. I myself am that bread from heaven. And there's a clear connection to the Eucharist. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life within you. I am the bread that came down from heaven. So there's a clear connection that God provides, God feeds. Even in our grumbling, God is there with us. So then Moses goes up onto the mountain, and he receives the covenants, receives the commandments. The great theophany, as it says in chapter 19, God goes and communicates with Moses, or Moses goes and communicates with God. Chapter 20, we receive the 10 commandments, some of the most famous piece, of course, of the entire Bible. and he only sees God's back. As it says in chapter 33, and all this time that Moses goes up there, I will remove my hand so that you may see my back, but my face is not to be seen. The idea is no one can see God's face and live because it's so profound. It would blow our minds, literally. We'd explode. We could not take it in. It's too amazing. So Moses sees God's back. That's the idea. He can't see his front. And Moses's face becomes radiant because he is in this communion with God. His face becomes radiant. Now, here is a very interesting piece of history, I think. They saw, this is the passage. They saw how radiant the skin of his face had become. But here's Michelangelo and his carving of Moses. And notice, strangely, I don't know if anyone noticed anything strange about this statue, but Moses has horns, which is very weird. Why did Moses become a goat? It's very odd. Well, here's what happens. So here's another example of, remember, Hebrew does not have vowels. So the word for horns in Hebrew is keren. Rays of light is karan. So when you have the word KRN, is that keren or is that karan? And so there was a mistranslation, a misunderstanding that for some centuries, there was this teaching that Moses grew horns when he went and visited God. And that's why you have Michelangelo carving this image of Moses with horns. But really the proper translation that we believe is rays of light, that he was beaming from his communication with God. But that's a little interesting side note of Christian history of sometimes we misunderstand things. And so I don't think any scholars say today that Moses grew horns, but they would say that his face became radiant. I don't know what the theology is of growing horns. Okay. There is one other I forgot to make note of this, but we'll get to that in a later book. Just a few other things of note from the boring section. So again, what we have is in chapter we have in chapter 25 through 28, I think, or something like that was 30, chapter 30. We have the description, the plans. Here's what we're going to do, or here's what God is going to ask us to do. But also in this part, we have several talkings or several pieces about the Sabbath. So for instance, chapter 31, 13 through 15, these are very strong words. Take care to keep my Sabbaths is a token between you. I think I made a typo. You and I. Might be you. I think it's you and I, not you and I. Let me look. It's supposed to be you and me. Take care to keep my Sabbath. That is the token between you and me, not you and I. But that's kind of cute. Throughout the generations, autocorrect. To show that it is I, the Lord, who make you holy. Therefore, you must keep the Sabbath as something sacred. Whoever desecrates it shall be put to death. If anyone does work on that day, he must be rooted out from his people. 6 days there are for doing work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of complete rest, sacred to the Lord. Anyone who does work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. And then, oops, I meant to put that lower. But 35:3, sorry about that, is also very strong words. 2 and 3. Anyone who does work on that day shall be put to death. You shall not even light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Strong words. And so when we hear things like in John chapter 9, where we hear this beautiful story about the man being born blind, and Jesus heals often. He does all these amazing healings. So if we flip to John 9 real quick, it talks about he saw a man blind from birth. The disciple said, was his parent, this man who sinned, or his parents, that he was born blind? He says, neither. And he has this beautiful passage of healing. He made clay and anointed the eyes and heals him. But then it says in chapter 14, now Jesus had made clay and opened his eyes on a Sabbath. So this becomes the point of accusation of the Pharisees and the scribes against Jesus. But to their defense, this Pharisees and scribes and everything, it speaks very, very strongly. This is the words that they are reading. This is the Pentateuch. It's the word from God coming from Moses. It says very strongly, you shall not even light a fire. That's considered work. Don't even turn on the lights. That is how much you shall rest. That is how serious the Sabbath is. So Jesus had to really help redefine that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. But that was very profound teaching to kind of change someone's way of thinking. Yes. Changing someone's way of thinking, this is a bit of a side note, changing someone's way of thinking that is very locked in to what they believe and what they think, that is not an easy task. Not to get too political. But if you've got someone who is just as a note, right? If you've got someone who is a diehard pro-Trump person, for instance, it's really hard to say anything that maybe this is not the best thing. Or someone who is on the other side, very anti-Trump, it's very hard to say that anything is positive, right? If people get really locked into their way of thinking, there is no room for grace and no room for transformation. So we are called to allow room for grace and allow room for Christ to change our hearts. And the Pharisees had become so set in this that they did not even let the Son of Man, the Messiah, change their way of thinking. So just an example of how the hardness of heart, getting locked in, sometimes can not allow us to hear the grace that we need to hear. It's a bit of a side note. The other thing, of course, as we hear of is the golden calf, which happens in chapter 32, where we then have this clarification, you shall not make for yourselves molten gods. That was supposed to be higher up. I missed a couple little edit things there. So we have the re-giving of the covenant. And it's interesting if you compare chapter 34 with the renewal of the tablets. Remember, Moses was all upset with the people and he throws those tablets down. Well, then he goes and he gets the tablets again. So if we compare chapter 20, verse 2, chapter 20, verse 2 says, I, the Lord, am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. You shall not have other gods besides me. You shall not carve idols for yourselves in the shape of anything in the sky above, or in the earth below, or in the waters below the earth. And then if we go to chapter 34, it says, talks about the religious laws. I am the Lord. And then chapter 34, verse 17, you shall not make for yourselves molten gods. So let me clarify this whole golden calf thing. No, in case I was not clear. I like that because sometimes, our laws are that way too. It's like, well, you never said I couldn't do that. We didn't carve anything. We just made it out of gold. We collect everyone's gold and we made a golden calf. You never said we couldn't make a golden calf. You said we couldn't carve things. We didn't carve things. We molted it. And then God says, okay, you shall not molt out of gold either. So I just kind of like that response is, let me just be more clear. That is also against who I am. So clarification that Moses gets the second time round. So that mostly summarizes then the book of Exodus. Hopefully this has been helpful. It's hard to get all of those themes into, and I went a little bit over today, but that covers a lot of Exodus. And next week we'll cover Leviticus. So I'll give some time for some thoughts here, if you have any thoughts. And let me exit here, stop share. Now we'll go over, oops. All right, so now if you have any thoughts, feel free to share. Karen, you put a thought in there. I thought the Israelites had taken their flocks with them, and so why did they need God to provide meat? Good question. I don't know, but it seems that those flocks were still not enough to feed the people, and they didn't have any. They didn't bring like their seed. It doesn't say that they brought their seeds with them and like their vegetables and stuff. So they hold on a second, Karen. Let me figure out why I can't get you unmuted. There's something different that is happening now. I see that your mouth is moving. Let me see if I can ask all to unmute. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself now, I think. Well, it says ask to unmute.
Now you can hear me?
Yes, ask all to unmute. Okay, there we go. I'll do that.
It looks like the rest are still muted.
Yeah.
There.
Hola, Armando. We're finishing our previous class here.
Yeah.
So we'll be there in a minute.
Bring your cursor down to the lower left-hand corner and you'll see a whole new thing pop up. And at the very lower left-hand corner is the mute thing, and it has a red line through it. That's where you have to click to be able to talk, because two of you are still, yeah, Patty, you're having trouble, and is that so?
Ask all to unmute. I'm gonna unmute you, ask you to unmute.
I chose to stay muted, but you can unmute.
I just helpful, okay. You know. Sorry.
It just wasn't working.
And then you ask about, is it all decided depending on where you live? What point does the East become the West?
In fact, that has to do with the fact that in the United States, we have the East, the Midwest, and the West identified. And I've often wondered, where do the people all over the world, where do those things change? Because for us and for the Western world, we're talking about the Mideast and the East because it's all east of us. But isn't there some line like the National Divide, that sort of thing, that says, okay, now this is changing? I just am curious. It has nothing to do with the Bible study. I just thought I'd ask you because you're so well read.
I don't know. I think every kind of culture and country has their own kind of perspective of where things are. I mean, we might be considered east to China. I don't know, actually. We have generally accepted those terms, I think, in the East and the West, but I'm not sure if those are accepted over there in China or not. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions that people might have here? Checking the Facebook here. Hopefully this has been helpful and interesting.
I have one more, if you don't mind.
Please.
In chapter 32, from verses 27 through 29, God tells all the Levites to go out and kill their brothers and neighbors and friends, and they do it. And my version of God is a loving God, the whole sure. Jesus thing, and that's pretty cruel. Starts in 26, verse 26, and then goes on.
It could be after the golden calf. They weren't on board with God's plan.
Yeah, and then he says, the next piece is that Moses said, you have committed a grave sin. But yes, it also could be the response to, I think it's the cleansing out, it's the Levites cleansing out the those who had sinned against the golden calf. And so the idea of blasphemy is a very serious sin. And again, remember, think of this as stylized history and a different understanding in a different time in a different place. And to the Old Testament defense, they really believe in God is holy and not to be profaned. I mean, how often and to our non-defense, how often do we just say, oh, it was just, you can say, oh my God, it's not a big deal or whatever, or, it's just an expression or whatever. And we don't defend God. And because God is loving and he can take it and whatever. And so maybe having this balance of where we are as moderns that do not think that blasphemy is a really serious sin. It is a serious sin, and the book of Exodus is there to remind us of that. Now, does God condone that killing? Well, again, it's really hard to get, just remember it's stylized history, and it's meant to tell us more, because we moderns jump to, oh, those poor souls, or God is condoning murder or whatever. And if we get too caught up into that, we're going to have real trouble reading really a lot of the Bible, because we hear God saying those kinds of things. So think often of it as we read the Old Testament. It's kind of we're either on God's side or we're against God. And if we are against God, we need to root out anything that stands against God. And that's one of the main messages of the Old Testament, is rooting out everything that stands in the way of God. Now, again, don't translate that too much to our modern times, because if we take that too literally, we end up with
killing each other.
Really awful things like
it's not good.
forming a capital in the name of God or whatever. So that's,
yeah, exactly.
So that's how we have to be careful. And that's why we don't read the Bible literally, right? So we want to understand what's the original intent and what are we getting at and what is translatable to our time. There's also in Petrie's book, he also mentioned about the commandments and how the 10 commandments are universal and for all people. And some of these other commandments are for a particular tribe, for that one holy tribe. And a lot of those things have been replaced then by Christ, not the 10 commandments, but the other particular laws of the nations are to be understood for a particular people in a particular time. And not necessarily all of those are translatable to our time. And we'll get more into that in Leviticus, where we go through all those laws.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And personally, I found the business of the initiation of circumcision coming about because of God wanting to kill Moses, and Moses's wife cuts off the foreskin, and all of a sudden this becomes a really good idea. And you had said last time that that was because of Abraham not trusting God enough not to sleep with Hagar to try to continue his line. And I just found that very interesting, that all fits together so well. I never had understood that before.
Great.
I've always wondered why Aaron kind of got away with it. He helped build the golden calf and
right.
But then he still has this prominent position.
Exactly.
They made me do it.
No, that's a really good point. And I was wondering the same thing myself. He does, I think he says, well, it's those people. He blames it on the other people.
It's just always been a little bit of a mystery to me.
It's
in some ways,
supposedly God doesn't play favorites and he doesn't pick and choose, but then you have those kinds of stories that say, well, sometimes sort of he does.
Well, there is maybe the connection, I'm speaking just off the top of my brain here, is maybe the connection also between Adam and Eve, where they also play the blame game, and God doesn't slay them, but he does punish them. And so Aaron doesn't necessarily get away with it, but he is. I think he is slapped on the wrist anyway. But his punishment could have been greater. Moses, as I was reading it, clearly God is not pleased with Aaron, but he is not. His life isn't taken. And again, if we can connect that to Adam and Eve, he was not pleased with Adam and Eve, but he does not kill him. He just casts them out of the garden and says there's consequences. The other thing I was going to say is remember where we were from Genesis, and one of the great things of all the violence and strange things that were going on in Genesis, Exodus in many ways is a good response, is how much we need the law. And again, a lot of these things that happen, the law is brand new for one, and they haven't applied it yet, and they need to understand that this is the way that they are going to live. And so that takes some time too. So that might be something to consider, that they just received those tablets, but just because the law has now come does not mean it's automatically put into practice. Sometimes it takes some time to understand what that even means. And I think that might be a way to think of the Israelite people as well, of we have received it, but that doesn't mean that we're following it yet. And so this turning away from God and going to the calf, okay, let me stress that this is something that you are going to do.
So he grinds it down and they drink it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Any other questions or thoughts or points? Was this helpful?
Yes.
Very helpful. Thank
Meryl?
you.
Yeah, great.
And we will see you all next week. Thank you, Father.
So Leviticus is next week, and yeah, we'll see you then.
I'll
Thanks
see if I
everyone
can
for joining.
find
Thank
my
you.
email. I lost my email. That's why I couldn't get in.
I see. All right, well, we'll see you all next time.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
Yep.